Imagine a system built from the ground up, not to uplift, but to hold an entire community back. From the earliest days of slavery, through the harsh realities of Jim Crow, to the rise of mass incarceration, Black Americans have faced barriers deliberately woven into the very fabric of U.S. institutions. But why? And how did it all begin? In the 1600s, long before the concept of whiteness existed, poor Europeans and African laborers often shared common struggles, bound by poverty and oppression. The elite, recognizing a potential alliance that could threaten their power, created the idea of a racial hierarchy, a clever division designed to pit people against one another and protect the wealth and control of a few. This was not a random act of prejudice, it was strategy. By convincing some that their skin color made them superior, the elites ensured that collective resistance would be nearly impossible, laying the foundation for centuries of inequality. Today, echoes of that system remain, shaping education, policing, housing, and economic opportunities. Understanding this history is not about blame, it is about awareness, about seeing patterns that continue to influence lives and communities. It is about shining a light on the structures that have shaped generations, and learning how to challenge them. If you are ready to uncover the hidden history that textbooks often overlook, to see the threads of strategy and manipulation that have shaped America, you are in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we explore the untold stories, the truths too long ignored, and the powerful lessons that history can teach us today. This is a journey you won't to miss, because understanding the past is the first step toward changing the future. As the colonies of what would become the United States were taking shape, the balance of power rested in the hands of a small group of wealthy landowners who controlled not only the land, but also the labor that made their fortunes possible. These elites faced a dilemma that could have unraveled their entire system. They were heavily outnumbered by the very people whose labor sustained them. African laborers, both enslaved and indentured, worked the fields alongside poor European settlers, who themselves had limited rights, no land, and little hope for advancement. The potential for unity among these groups posed a direct threat to the elite's control. If black and white laborers recognized their shared struggles, if they saw themselves as equals in hardship rather than divided by the arbitrary lines of skin color, a collective uprising could easily topple the social and economic order that enriched the few at the expense of the many. Faced with this risk, the colonial elite devised a strategy both subtle and ingenious. They created distinctions that would elevate some just enough to secure their loyalty, while keeping them economically subordinate. Poor Europeans, who had no ownership, no security, and little power, were offered small privileges, land grants, legal recognition, and positions like slave patrols, enough to make them feel included in a hierarchy that positioned them above African laborers. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. By granting these relative advantages, the elites ensured that poor Europeans would begin to see themselves as members of a team, not with those who shared their struggles but against them. They were given a taste of power and respectability, and in exchange, they helped enforce the system, policing the very people who, just years before, could have been their allies. This arrangement created a carefully calibrated tension between communities that might otherwise have formed alliances, a social wedge that has echoed through centuries. On one side, African laborers endured the relentless exploitation of slavery and the legal and social mechanisms that followed, while on the other, white laborers, though also constrained and oppressed, were convinced that their skin color offered a protective shield. The line between privilege and oppression became a tool, a psychological barrier designed to fragment solidarity and secure the elite's dominance. It was not merely about wealth or power, it was about perception, loyalty, and fear, the promise of respectability and recognition. even if superficial, ensured that poor Europeans were invested in the maintenance of a system that fundamentally disadvantaged both them and their black neighbors. Over time, the implications of this arrangement extended far beyond the plantations and small colonial towns. The mindset it cultivated, the understanding that some should be elevated above others based on constructed notions of race, laid the groundwork for centuries of systemic inequality. Policies and social norms evolved to reinforce these divisions. From the codification of laws that favored white citizens to the exclusion of black Americans from opportunities for advancement, and even into modern systems of policing, housing, and economic opportunity, the initial co-opting of poor Europeans was not a temporary measure. It was the seed of a social and political strategy that would shape the country for generations, ensuring that the pressures and injustices of the elite's design were felt across communities, yet always in ways that kept unity just out of reach. Understanding this history reveals the mechanics of how privilege and subordination were intertwined, and how the divisions found centuries ago continue to influence the present. The story of these early alliances and manipulations is more than a historical footnote. It is a lens through which we can examine the structures that persist today, illuminating the enduring consequences of deliberate strategies designed to control, divide, and dominate. It shows how a calculated distribution of relative power, small as it may have seemed, became a linchpin in sustaining a system built to favor a few while limiting the potential of many. As the young nation grew, the fragile balance of labor and power meticulously engineered by the colonial elite continued to evolve, and the tools they had used to maintain control became ever more sophisticated. The initial strategy of granting small privileges to poor European settlers had done more than secure loyalty. It had created a deeply ingrained worldview, one that equated social value with skin color, and it became the foundation of an ideology that would later be known as white supremacy. Poor whites, who had once suffered the same economic vulnerability as their black neighbors, were now mobilized not by a promise of true equality but by the illusion of superiority, a promise that their lives would matter more simply because of their race. This ideological framework was reinforced through law, custom, and culture, compelling them to defend a system of slavery and exploitation that benefited the wealthy few while leaving them materially constrained and politically powerless. In essence, the very people who could have joined forces with black laborers to challenge entrenched hierarchies were instead enlisted as guardians of the hierarchy itself, defending institutions that fundamentally worked against their own long-term interests. The consequences of this manipulation did not end with the abolition of slavery. Though legal shackles were broken, the social and psychological structures created by centuries of racialized division persisted, morphing to suit the needs of those in power. In the modern era, rhetoric surrounding immigration, minority rights, and cultural change has often served the same function that slave patrols and coded privileges once did. It diverts attention away from systemic economic exploitation, ensuring that working-class people remain fragmented along lines of race, ethnicity, or nationality. Politicians and media voices exploit these divisions, framing the struggle for economic survival as a zero-sum game between racial or cultural groups, rather than a structural problem rooted in the concentration of wealth and influence. The lessons of the colonial era are starkly visible here. Just as poor Europeans were once incentivized to defend a system that enriched elites, modern working-class communities are often drawn into battles that obscure the forces truly shaping their economic realities. The persistence of this pattern illustrates the enduring power of perception in maintaining social hierarchies, economic policies that favor the wealthy, tax systems that prioritize capital over labor, and access to education, healthcare, and housing continue to shape the lives of millions. Yet the narrative often presented to the public focuses on identity, culture, and symbolic markers of belonging. By emphasizing who is other or threatening, Those in positions of authority ensure that collective action against structural inequities remains difficult. Even as shared economic hardship continues to grow, historical patterns repeat because the underlying logic divide and control remains effective. What began with colonial elites manipulating perceptions of relative privilege has extended through centuries, subtly adapting to new contexts while preserving the same outcome: a system where the few prosper at the expense of the many, and where divisions among the laboring classes prevent unified resistance. Understanding this continuum from early colonial strategies to modern rhetoric reveals how ideologies of race and identity have been mobilized as instruments of social and economic control. It illuminates the ways in which historical structures, carefully designed to fragment potential alliances, continue to shape the present, influencing not only policy and opportunity, but also the very ways communities perceive their interests. The story of poor whites defending slavery, and today's analogous divisions among working-class populations, underscores a profound truth about power. It is maintained not only through wealth or force, but through the subtle and enduring shaping of beliefs, loyalties, and perceived hierarchies, ensuring that the work of systemic change remains a challenge even when the need for justice is urgent and apparent. When Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast, it revealed not only the physical vulnerabilities of the region, but also the deep social fractures that had been meticulously constructed over centuries. As waters rose and infrastructure collapsed, the disaster exposed the stark inequities in housing, resources, and emergency response, disproportionately affecting Black communities who had been systematically marginalized and denied access to wealth and opportunity for generations. Yet, amidst the chaos and desperation, a troubling pattern emerged. Rather than recognizing the structural failings that left entire neighborhoods exposed, many white working-class communities directed their anger and frustration toward their Black neighbors. Stories circulated of resentment and blame, as if the suffering of one group could somehow justify or explain the inequities they themselves experienced. This reaction was not accidental. It reflected a long-standing social dynamic, one that historians and social analysts have traced back to the earliest days of colonial America, when elites deliberately divided poor Europeans and African laborers to prevent unified resistance against concentrated power. The strategy was subtle but effective. By encouraging poor whites to perceive themselves as inherently superior, as participants in a hierarchy that granted them status in exchange for loyalty, elites ensured that grievances would be misdirected, focused on those who shared similar struggles rather than the systems and institutions that perpetuated inequity. In the aftermath of Katrina, this dynamic played out vividly. Media narratives and political rhetoric often emphasized lawlessness, looting, and disorder in predominantly Black neighborhoods while minimizing the failures of government agencies, the inadequacies of living systems, and the neglect of infrastructure that had long endangered these communities. By framing the crisis as a problem of individual or cultural responsibility rather than systemic neglect, attention was diverted from policies and practices that enriched the few at the expense of the many, reinforcing pre-existing divisions and deflecting anger away from the institutions that had failed. This phenomenon illustrates a persistent truth. The social and economic structures designed centuries ago continue to shape perceptions and allegiances in profound ways. Just as poor Europeans were once mobilized to defend slavery and uphold an artificial hierarchy, contemporary working-class populations can be drawn into conflicts that obscure shared interests, particularly in moments of crisis. The scapegoating of Black communities after Katrina exemplifies how narratives of racial difference are weaponized to fragment potential coalitions, ensuring that collective action to demand justice or equitable resources remains difficult. It is a reminder that history is not merely a record of past events, but a living influence on contemporary social consciousness, shaping who we see as responsible, who we trust, and who we fight against, often to the benefit of those who hold the most power. Moreover, Katrina underscores the role of perception in maintaining social control. The catastrophe revealed that disasters are not experienced equally. They are filtered through long-standing inequalities, and the interpretation of those experiences can reinforce the very hierarchies that contributed to vulnerability in the first place. When white working-class communities internalize narratives that cast black neighbors as threats or competitors, the energy that could be directed towards systemic reform instead becomes dispersed, consumed by tension and mistrust. This misdirection mirrors the strategies employed by elites across history, from colonial times to the modern era, demonstrating the enduring efficacy of racialized division as a tool of social and economic control. Understanding Katrina not just as a natural disaster, but as a moment that exposed the deliberate manipulation of social perceptions reveals a deeper story about power and inequality. It is a story in which crises illuminate existing fractures, where long-standing ideologies of race and privilege intersect with lived experience, and where the work of recognizing and challenging these dynamics becomes urgent. The misdirection of anger and blame, the reinforcement of false hierarchies, and the persistence of systemic neglect all remind us that structural inequities are maintained not only by policy and wealth, but by the subtle shaping of beliefs and loyalties, ensuring that the struggle for justice requires both awareness of history and vigilance in the present. As the layers of history unfold, it becomes clear that the legacy of systemic oppression is not confined to the distant past, but continues to shape the lived experiences of Black Americans in profound and measurable ways. Surveys and studies consistently reveal that a majority of Black individuals perceive discrimination across multiple facets of society, from politics to policing, from the courts and prisons to access to healthcare, and even in subtle forms of population control. These perceptions are not anecdotal or exaggerated. They reflect patterns reinforced over centuries, confirming the observations made by scholars like Tim Wise, who argue that U.S. institutions were deliberately designed to disadvantage Black communities while presenting an illusion of neutrality. The historical strategies of division, manipulation, and co-optation have evolved, taking forms that are more bureaucratic, more systemic, and often invisible, yet no less powerful, demonstrating that the structures built to maintain racial hierarchies are enduring, adaptive, and deeply embedded. In politics, Black Americans often confront gerrymandering, voter suppression, and policy decisions that disproportionately impact their communities, a modern echo of the disenfranchisement that began with the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws. In policing and incarceration, the overrepresentation of Black people in arrests and long-term sentences mirrors historical mechanisms of control, from slave patrols to convict leasing, highlighting how legal systems have long functioned to maintain social and economic dominance. Healthcare disparities further illustrate this systemic pattern, as communities with limited access to quality care experience higher rates of preventable illness and lower life expectancy, consequences of policies and investments that historically favored wealthier, predominantly white neighborhoods. Even efforts aimed at controlling population growth, whether through targeted family planning initiatives or inequitable access to reproductive health care, reveal a continuum of strategies aimed at restricting opportunity and autonomy, echoing centuries-old tactics designed to suppress Black advancement. What emerges from these patterns is a narrative of resilience under pressure, a story of communities navigating structures that were never meant to serve them. The lived reality of discrimination is validated not only by individual experiences but by data, by the consistency of outcomes across regions, generations, and systems. It underscores the enduring relevance of historical analysis, understanding the strategies deployed by colonial elites, the ideology of white supremacy that mobilized poor whites against shared interests, and the modern manifestations of these divisions allows us to see discrimination not as isolated incidents but as a sustained and intentional pattern. Recognition of this systemic targeting is not merely academic. It is a lens through which the persistence of inequity can be traced, explained, and ultimately challenged. Yet within this story lies a profound tension. Awareness of systemic oppression coexists with the everyday determination to survive. thrive, and resist. Black communities have historically responded to these pressures with creativity, solidarity, and activism, forming networks of support and institutions that push back against structural inequities. The perception of discrimination fuels both vigilance and strategy, encouraging individuals and organizations to navigate barriers while advocating for change. It also highlights a critical lesson about societal awareness. The structures that perpetuate inequity rely on invisibility and normalization, making the act of seeing, naming, and documenting discrimination essential to dismantling it. In understanding these contemporary manifestations of systemic targeting, one can trace a direct line from the past to the present, connecting centuries of social engineering, manipulation of racial hierarchies, and deliberate policies of exclusion to the ongoing challenges Black Americans face today. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward meaningful engagement, toward the creation of a society where inequity is not normalized, and where the lessons of history inform not only our understanding of the present, but the possibilities of a more just future. As we reach the close of this story, it is important to reflect on the insight Tim Wise provides. Systemic racism is not an unfortunate byproduct of society, but a foundational element embedded deeply within the laws, policies, and culture of the United States. From the Naturalization Act of 1790, which explicitly restricted citizenship, to modern policies that disproportionately affect Black communities, these structures were designed to preserve power and privilege for the dominant group. The patterns of inequality we have explored: segregation, economic manipulation, legal discrimination, and cultural marginalization are not accidental. They are the result of deliberate systems that continue to influence opportunities, access, and outcomes today. Wise reminds us that the deficits and injustices we see are not inherent flaws within marginalized communities, but are instead rooted in the dominant culture that benefits from maintaining these inequities. Understanding this distinction is essential, because it shifts the focus from blaming those who are oppressed to acknowledging the responsibilities of those who inherit structural advantages. The challenge, then, is not about assigning guilt for historical wrongs, but about recognizing that responsibility lies in actively addressing and dismantling these inequities. It is a call to engage thoughtfully, to educate ourselves and others, and to support policies, institutions, and practices that promote fairness and justice. From confronting discriminatory laws and advocating for equitable education, to challenging biased policing and economic disparities, each action contributes to breaking the cycles that have persisted for centuries. The story we have explored demonstrates that awareness alone is not enough. It must be paired with action, with a commitment to reshaping society in ways that allow every individual, regardless of race, to thrive without systemic barriers holding them back. This is a story about choice: the choice to see the structures around us clearly, to understand how history shapes the present, and to participate in creating a future that is more just and inclusive. By acknowledging the deep roots of systemic racism, we gain the clarity needed to advocate for meaningful change. And by embracing responsibility rather than guilt, we empower ourselves and our communities to take concrete steps toward equity. The lessons of history, the voices of those who have endured oppression, and the research of scholars like Tim Wise all converge to guide us in this effort. Thank you for taking the time to listen and engage with this story. Your attention matters, your understanding matters, and your willingness to act matters. If this journey through history and systemic inequity has provided insight, reflection, or motivation, please consider supporting this channel by liking and subscribing. By doing, you join a growing community committed to awareness, justice, and the pursuit of a society where structural inequities no longer determine the possibilities of anyone's life. Together, we can carry these lessons forward, honor the struggles of the past, and contribute to a future defined not by division, but by understanding, equity,